Listening to Joe Biden last night according to British summertime, I quickly came to the conclusion that the presidential elections on the 3rd of November in the United States will play out on two vectors. On the one hand, there is light versus darkness conversation. And on the other hand, there will be one of empathy versus toughness. At least that is my initial reaction, having listened quite attentively to what he said. And what he said was quite impressive too. But that is not why I'm sharing some thoughts with you today. That is another continent, another area of expertise for others. Let me come back to the MENA and Gulf regions, and therefore let me welcome you to Intuitive Reactions number 12. Earlier today, I listened to a conversation, an interview, a special chat with the Arab intellectual and thinker, Dr Azmi Bishara, who also happens to be the director of the Arab Center in Doha in Qatar, in which he was sharing his views with the interviewer about the various issues in the MENA and Gulf regions, not least, of course, the two prominent ones that came up, which were the so-called normalization of relations between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, the catalyst being the United States there, and also on the post-blast in Beirut and what happens to Lebanon. The interview, in Arabic, it's a hadith khas, was with Al-Araby television. Now, it's very interesting because I pretty much agree with a lot of what Dr. Bishara said. He's somebody who shares his thoughts often on television and in the media, and he is one of the prominent thinkers of the Arab world today. So let me basically highlight to my own listeners in my own way, once again, having already done a YouTube episode on the matter and having also shared with you a written script of my intuitive reactions, let me basically highlight some of the issues that, in my opinion, led to this normalization, to this hasty and public exposure, as it were, of the relationship between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. Of course, there are various factors that persuaded both sides to agree with the American efforts to come to an agreement, to come out in the open, as it were. Of course, people have talked that it is a joint stand against Iran. It is also a joint stand against Turkey. People have talked about weapons, that this rapprochement, that the diplomatic relations would then allow America to sell to the United Arab Emirates F-35 fighters, drones, and all sorts of other military material because Israel will not object and therefore the Americans will be able to do so and get lots of money for it, as President Trump often says. It's also, I think, an alliance because both Israel and the United Arab Emirates are dead set against Islamist movements in the whole MENA Gulf region. They're also, incidentally, very much against all attempts at democracy, the popular protests that we have seen, starting with 2010, 2011 with the Arab Spring, and then they were succeeded by those in Sudan, Algeria, etc. So they're against those attempts. at democracy, because for them, that is not what they want, for their separate reasons. Israel has its own reasons and the UAE has its own. So they're against what a dear friend, but also a wonderful analyst, Rami Khouri, prefers to call revolutionary uprisings. So there is there again a synergy of objectives. And the United Arab Emirates was looking for a dependable, in its opinion, ally in the region, and that fell upon Israel. So now we see what is this political haste in trying to get this relationship going publicly. Some people would go so far as to say that it is a rather crude and inelegant love fest that has suddenly sprung up. But interestingly enough, many of the Arab countries have stayed silent on it. They haven't expressed any opinion on whether this is the right move or not. Interestingly enough, there have been some signs of discontent from the Maghreb countries as well: Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Tunis. But what I think also is quite interesting here is the role that Saudi Arabia plays, because as I have said in the past myself, both in my written intuitive reactions as well as in my earlier YouTube, that the countries I'd be looking at for future normalization, between inverted commas, would be Bahrain, of course with Saudi consent, as well as Sudan. And I also added there the Sultanate of Oman, although opinions are divided as to whether the new Sultan would undertake this step or not. But it is quite clear that one key player there is Saudi Arabia, and people have been asking, what would Saudi Arabia do publicly? Now, in my opinion, it's well nigh impossible that this normalization between the UAE and Israel will have taken place without Saudi knowledge and perhaps even approval, because of the closeness of the relations between the two crown princes, MBZ and MBS. But interestingly enough, there is also a generational gap, I think, in Saudi Arabia between the king, who hails from an older generation. He is the king whose country has provided the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which basically was based on land for peace. It is a country that has been viewed as the leader of the Muslim world, and the crown prince, who comes from a far, far younger generation and wants to do things differently. And if you read a piece by the academic Dr Rashid Madawi in Middle East Eye, it actually talks about the dilemma facing the Saudi king and leadership with regard to this normalization. But in a nutshell, what this has done is that, in my opinion, it has attempted, or it is attempting, to replace the land for peace formula. In other words, Israel has to give back the occupied lands to the Palestinians in return for peace with all Arab countries members of the Arab League. That formula, which has been so consistent for so long, has now been replaced, or is being replaced, by another one called peace for peace. In other words, forget whether Israel gives the Palestinian the occupied lands back. We want to make peace with Israel, and Israel wants to make peace with us. It is our right, and therefore the issue of the land, the issue of the Palestinian rights, the issue of the Palestinian struggle for justice does not count in this equation. This is basically where we are at the moment. Land for peace, now peace for peace. Now, there are many things that could be said for and against this, but I would only say two things. One, no matter what those formulae are, whether it's land for peace, whether it's peace for peace, the Palestinian struggle will continue. But the only way that the Palestinian struggle will really continue, in my opinion, is not by relying on the Gulf countries, on the MENA countries, on outside forces from America to France to Russia to China to the United Nations or the European Union. It is for Palestinians to get their act together. That is central to the future now. They have basically been checkmated by this agreement to a large extent, and their next move will show whether they completely throw the chessboard away or whether they manage to continue the struggle by actually coming together and working together, renewing, reformatting the PLO and trying to, in a sense, come up with a new front that will be able to market their struggle and to show that their struggle is one for peace and justice and security in a region where they have their own right for self-determination. And the other thing I would say is that the idea that the United Arab Emirates and its crown prince or its leaders of the 7 Emirates have actually tailored this agreement for normalization does not at all mean that the Arab masses across the large swathe of the Middle East, North Africa or Gulf regions are actually pro-normalization, pro this kind of recognition without first a resolution of the Palestinian problem. Time and time again, polls have shown that the Arab masses are hugely in favor of the Palestinian struggle for justice, and it is only a question of their being so weary with their own struggles and the sort of strong imposition of central despotic forces that has made it impossible for them to express their opinions more freely. If there is one point where I would disagree with Dr. Azmi Bishara in his interview with Al-Araby TV, is when he said that this decision has nothing to do with a sovereign decision by the United Arab Emirates, that this is not a legal right or a legal understanding. I would respectfully disagree with that, and I would say that it is very much a sovereign decision by a sovereign country. The question is not the sovereignty of the decision, in my opinion, but its ramifications, its repercussions, and its consequences upon the United Arab Emirates, upon the Gulf and MENA regions, and upon the Arab world. I'll stop there and very quickly turn my attention to Lebanon, because I also attended a wonderful webinar where 3 wonderful speakers, Rami Khouri, again, I just mentioned him, Joe Bahout, and Nasser Saidi came together in order to talk, well, came together, they were brought together by the Brookings Doha Centre to talk about what happens next in Lebanon post the Beirut blast, that horrendous blast, and the verdict of the special tribunal for Lebanon that was delivered in The Hague a couple of days ago. And the question was, do we have a national unity government? Does Lebanon need a national unity government? Does Lebanon need a new government? Is now the time for bureaucrats and independents to take over, or what? What are the options? I think Lebanon is in a very difficult position. Lebanon has to make difficult choices. And I think that to say, get rid of every political party and representation in government, who incidentally are a product of the parliament, those people in government have their factions in parliament. So if that were the case, then just getting rid of those people without having an agenda that is clear, that's consistent, that is marketable and doable is going to be very, very difficult. But one way, perhaps, of looking at this and trying to perhaps, I don't know, overcome the substantial differences is to go for elections, fresh elections after a few months, and there are stages to get there, that would basically replace the confessional sectarian system in Lebanon, where each person has a leader, a zaim, into one that respects the concept of citizenship, where all citizens of Lebanon are equal and they elect their own representatives. And whether that is done through the structure of a bicameral parliament, as the Taif Accord predicated, but which has never actually been applied, or by any other means, I leave it not only to the ingenuity of the Lebanese people and to other analysts and observers, but I'm sure we'll come back to that in another YouTube. At the moment, I bid you a good weekend, and I hope to meet with you again for another Intuitive Reactions next week. Take care.